Robert Whitman was 67 years old when he finally understood the difference between patience and surrender. For most of his life, he believed silence was strength. He believed enduring pain without complaint made a man dignified. He believed loyalty meant staying still while the people you loved slowly carved pieces out of you. He was wrong. Real patience was not passive. Real patience was preparation. On a cold October night in Franklin, Tennessee, Robert sat alone in the kitchen of the two-story colonial home he had spent 31 years paying for. A bowl of homemade chicken soup rested on the table in front of him, steam slowly disappearing into the quiet house. His wife had ignored every one of his calls since 9 that morning. At exactly 11 p.m., Linda Whitman finally came home. She walked through the front door, smelling like expensive hotel soap, and wearing the smile of someone returning from a private victory. She stood in the kitchen doorway for several seconds without speaking, studying her husband carefully, as though she had rehearsed the scene in advance. Then she calmly admitted she had slept with her boss, Daniel Mercer. Not once, not by mistake, and not with regret. She told Robert she planned to continue seeing him. The refrigerator hummed softly behind them. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. Linda waited for the explosion she believed was coming. 31 years of marriage should have guaranteed tears, shouting, broken dishes, something dramatic enough to reassure her that she still had power over the quiet old man sitting at the kitchen table. Instead, Robert lifted another spoonful of soup and told her it was getting cold. For the first time that night, uncertainty crossed Linda's face, because what she did not know, what she could not possibly have imagined, was that Robert Whitman had already spent the last 14 months preparing for the complete collapse of his marriage. By the time Linda understood what he had done, the bank accounts, the business, the future she believed belonged to her, and even the ground beneath her feet would already be gone. And Robert, the patient old carpenter's son from Tennessee, would be the only one left standing on solid ground. The wind outside moved through Cedar Hollow Drive with the dry whisper of late autumn leaves scraping across pavement. Inside the Whitman house, the kitchen lights cast long yellow reflections across granite countertops. Linda had insisted on installing 8 years earlier, during a renovation that nearly ended in divorce all by itself. Robert Whitman sat alone at the table in complete silence. The bowl of chicken soup in front of him had started cooling 20 minutes ago, but he continued eating slowly, methodically, as though finishing dinner properly still mattered even after everything else no longer did. His phone rested beside the bowl. 7 unanswered calls. 2 unread messages. No response since 9 that morning. At 67 years old, Robert had learned that instincts rarely arrive loudly. They came quietly. A shift in someone's eyes, a different tone in ordinary conversations, a laugh suddenly reserved for someone else. For over a year, he had felt Linda drifting further away from him without ever fully leaving. She still slept in the same bed, still kissed his cheek before work, still asked whether he wanted anything from the grocery store, but her presence inside the marriage had slowly evaporated long before this night. At 11:03 p.m., headlights swept across the front windows. Robert did not look up immediately. He heard Linda's heels against the hardwood floor, heard her purse land gently on the hallway table, heard the deliberate pause before she stepped into the kitchen doorway. She stood there with her arms folded loosely across her chest. "You're still awake," she said. Robert took another spoonful of soup before answering. "I was hungry." Linda smiled faintly, but there was tension underneath it now. She had expected something else. Worry, maybe. Anger. Questions. Instead, she found her husband eating dinner. "I ignored your calls today," she said carefully. "I noticed. And you're not going to ask where I was?" Robert finally looked at her then. 31 years together had made her face as familiar to him as his own reflection. But tonight, something inside her expression looked unfamiliar. Colder. Triumphant almost. Linda stepped further into the kitchen. "I was with Daniel Mercer." The words landed softly between them. Robert placed his spoon down beside the bowl. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Linda exhaled slowly and delivered the rest exactly the way she had clearly practiced it beforehand. "I slept with him," she said. "And I'm probably going to do it again." The refrigerator hummed quietly. Outside, wind rattled branches against the gutters. Linda watched him carefully, waiting. Robert understood the performance she expected, because he had imagined it himself many months ago. Shouting, rage. The collapse of a man discovering his marriage had been turned into a joke. Instead, He looked down at the soup. "It's good tonight," he said calmly. "Needs a little more salt, though." Confusion flashed across Linda's face so quickly she could not hide it. "That's all you have to say?" Robert lifted the spoon again. "The soup's getting cold." Linda stared at him another moment before laughing once under her breath, though there was no humor in it anymore, only discomfort. "You're unbelievable," she muttered. Then she turned and walked upstairs. Robert listened until the bedroom door closed. Only then did he set the spoon down completely. The kitchen suddenly felt very still. He sat there for another 15 minutes, finished every last bite of soup, washed the bowl carefully, dried it, and returned it to the cabinet, exactly where it belonged. Afterward, he walked quietly into the garage and closed the door behind him. For 4 minutes, Robert Whitman allowed himself to feel everything. Then he checked his watch, wiped his face dry, and started thinking about logistics. 14 months earlier, long before Linda stood in the kitchen confessing her affair, Robert Whitman sat inside a crowded barbecue restaurant in downtown Nashville, watching his wife laugh at something on her phone. The sound barely lasted 2 seconds, but Robert noticed it immediately, because it was not a laugh she used with him anymore. Linda tilted the screen away instinctively when she realized he had looked over. The movement was small, almost graceful, but after 31 years of marriage, Robert had learned that the smallest movements usually mattered most. "What's funny?" he asked. "Just something from work." She smiled quickly and slipped the phone into her purse. That should have been the end of it. For most husbands, maybe it would have been. But Robert had spent 40 years in construction before building Whitman Residential Group with Linda. He knew the danger of tiny fractures. Houses rarely collapsed all at once. The damage started deep inside places nobody checked until it was too late, and something inside his marriage had started cracking. Over the following months, the details accumulated quietly. Late meetings that stretched past 10 o'clock, weekend conferences that never seemed to produce anything specific, a new perfume Linda wore only occasionally, phone calls she answered outside, silences at dinner that felt occupied by someone else. None of it alone proved anything. Together, it became impossible not to see. The first person Robert spoke to was Thomas Bennett. They met at a narrow pub off Kingston Street on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Thomas had been Robert's closest friend since they worked construction sites together in their 20s, back when both of them still believed bad knees only happened to old men. Thomas listened without interrupting while Robert explained everything. When Robert finally finished, Thomas set his sandwich down slowly. "You think she's cheating?" Robert stared through the rain-covered window. "I think she left this marriage a long time ago," he said quietly. "I'm just not sure whether her body knows it yet." Thomas studied him carefully. "You confront her?" Robert shook his head immediately. "No." "Why not?" "Because if I'm wrong, I destroy my marriage for nothing." Robert paused. "And if I'm right, emotion won't help me." That answer seemed to settle something inside Thomas. A few moments later, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded business card. "Private investigator," he said. "Named Samuel Briggs. Used him years ago during a contractor lawsuit." Robert looked down at the card without touching it. "You really think it's gotten to that point?" Thomas leaned back in the booth. "I think you already know it has." 3 days later, Robert sat inside a law office on Maple Avenue across from Victoria Hale. She was in her early 50s, sharply dressed, composed, and carried herself with the calm efficiency of someone who did not waste time pretending unpleasant realities were pleasant. Robert explained the situation carefully. "I'm not here to file for divorce," he said. "Not yet." Victoria folded her hands together. "But you believe it's possible?" "Yes." "And you own a business together?" Robert nodded. "Most of our assets are tied to Whitman Residential Group." Victoria's expression sharpened slightly at that. "How much operational access does your wife currently have?" "Almost all of it." That answer hung heavily between them. Victoria opened a legal pad and wrote several notes before finally looking up again. "Mr. Whitman," she said evenly, "if there's even a possibility your marriage is deteriorating, you need to start protecting yourself now. Quietly. Legally. Completely." Robert sat very still. Outside the office window, downtown Franklin moved through its ordinary afternoon rhythms. Cars passed. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed loudly at something trivial. Meanwhile, the foundation beneath Robert Whitman's life had already started shifting, and for the first time, instead of hoping the damage would stop on its own, He began preparing for the collapse. Samuel Briggs operated out of a second-floor office above a hardware store on Willow Creek Road. The staircase leading up to it smelled faintly of dust, old coffee, and cigarette smoke that had probably soaked into the walls sometime during the Clinton administration. Robert Whitman climbed the stairs slowly on a gray November morning, carrying a folder that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Samuel opened the office door before Robert knocked. "You're early," he said. Robert glanced at his watch. 3 minutes. Samuel nodded once. Still early. The investigator was somewhere in his 60s, broad-shouldered, thinning gray hair, tired eyes that seemed permanently unimpressed by human behavior. Robert trusted him almost immediately for that reason alone. Inside, the office was cramped but organized. Filing cabinets lined the walls. A small television played muted local news in the corner while rain pressed softly against the windows. Samuel motioned toward a chair. "Tell me everything." Robert did. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just facts. Linda's distance, the late nights, the secrecy with her phone. The changes that individually meant nothing, but collectively meant everything. Samuel listened carefully without interrupting. When Robert finally finished, the investigator leaned back slightly. "How long you been married?" 31 years. Samuel whistled softly through his nose. "That's a long time to suddenly start imagining things." Robert looked down at his hands. "I hope I am imagining them." Samuel studied him for a few seconds before answering. "No, you don't." The words settled heavily into the room because they were true. Robert no longer wanted reassurance. He wanted certainty. Over the next several months, Samuel Briggs quietly inserted himself into the edges of Linda Whitman's life. He tracked hotel reservations, work schedules, restaurant receipts, phone records. The evidence came slowly at first, then all at once. One Friday afternoon in February, Samuel called Robert and asked him to come to the office immediately. When Robert arrived, a thick envelope sat on the desk between them. Samuel didn't speak right away. Instead, he slid several photographs across the desk, one at a time. Linda entering a downtown Nashville hotel. Linda leaving Daniel Mercer's black Mercedes. Linda sitting beside him at an outdoor restaurant nearly 40 miles from Franklin. In every picture, she looked relaxed, comfortable, familiar. Not like a woman having an affair, like a woman living a second life. Robert felt something cold settle into his chest. But surprisingly, it was not heartbreak anymore. It was confirmation. "How long?" he asked quietly. Samuel folded his arms. "Based on what I found, around 4 years." The number landed harder than the photographs. 4 years. Not a mistake. Not temporary weakness. A parallel relationship running quietly beneath his marriage for nearly half a decade. Robert stared silently at the table for several moments. Then Samuel reached into the envelope again. "There's something else." He handed Robert several printed financial statements. "At first, I thought it was unrelated," Samuel continued. "Routine vendor review while checking company records." Robert frowned as he scanned the pages. Payments. Dozens of them. Vendor name. Summit Asset Consulting. Robert looked up. "We never hired this company." "That's because it doesn't really exist," Samuel replied. The investigator explained everything carefully. The invoices appeared legitimate at first glance. Consulting fees, property assessments, vendor coordination services. But there was no physical office, no employees, no actual work attached to any payment. Over 4 years, more than $60,000 had quietly disappeared from Whitman Residential Group into the Shell vendor account, and every payment authorization carried Linda's approval. The room suddenly felt smaller. Samuel watched Robert carefully. "She's been moving money through the business for years." Robert slowly removed his glasses, not because he was shocked, because he finally understood something important. Linda had not betrayed him impulsively. She had betrayed him systematically, emotionally, financially, completely. Most men, Robert realized, would confront their wives immediately after discovering something like this. They would scream, demand answers, burn everything down in one emotional night. But Robert Whitman had spent his entire life building things carefully, and careful men understood something reckless people never did. The moment you revealed what you knew, the other person started hiding what you didn't. So instead of confronting Linda, Robert quietly gathered the photographs, the invoices, and the financial records. Then he looked at Samuel Briggs and asked the question that would quietly change the rest of his life. "What do I need to do next?" After Linda went upstairs, the Whitman house became unnaturally quiet. Robert remained seated at the kitchen table, staring at the nearly empty soup bowl in front of him while the refrigerator hummed softly nearby. The digital clock above the microwave read 11:26 p.m. 31 years. The number echoed in his mind without emotion now, almost like reading measurements from an old blueprint. 31 years of birthdays, mortgage payments, vacations, arguments about paint colors and retirement plans. 2 children raised inside those walls. Thousands of ordinary mornings that once felt permanent. And upstairs, his wife had just confessed that another man had been sharing pieces of her life for 4 of those years. Robert expected devastation to arrive eventually. Instead, he mostly felt tired. Not tired in the physical sense. Tired in the way old houses looked before demolition crews arrived. Structures standing upright simply because they had not yet been asked to collapse. He finished the last spoonful of soup slowly. Then he washed the bowl carefully by hand. Precision mattered to him, especially now. After drying the dish and returning it to the cabinet, Robert turned off the kitchen light and walked quietly through the darkened hallway toward the garage. The moment the garage door closed behind him, the silence changed. Private silence. Safe silence. The kind a man could finally break inside. Robert leaned both hands against the workbench beside his truck and lowered his head. For 4 full minutes, he allowed himself to feel everything he had refused to show upstairs. The humiliation, the anger, the grief. The unbearable image of Linda laughing with another man while sitting across from Robert at breakfast the following morning, pretending nothing had changed. His chest tightened sharply. For one dangerous moment, he wanted to storm back into the house and destroy something. But Robert Whitman had spent 14 months preparing precisely because emotions were temporary and consequences were permanent. So he looked down at his watch. 4 minutes. That was enough. He inhaled slowly, straightened his posture, and became practical again. Logistics. At 11:41 p.m., Robert entered the house through the garage door and walked directly to the hallway closet. 3 bags already waited inside. One contained clothes. One contained original financial documents, property records, tax files, and every piece of paperwork Victoria Hale had instructed him to secure months earlier. The 3rd bag held personal items he refused to leave behind. At the very top, wrapped carefully inside 2 folded blankets, rested the framed oil portrait of his mother, Evelyn Whitman. Robert lifted it gently. The painting had hung in the upstairs hallway for almost 20 years. Linda barely noticed it anymore. But Robert remembered exactly when it was painted. His mother sitting near the front porch in Joliet, wearing a pale blue dress, while his father complained about the cost of commissioning artwork they could not afford. His mother laughed anyway. "She'll outlive both of us now," she had told his father. Turns out, she had been right. Robert carried the bags quietly to the truck in 3 separate trips. Upstairs, the bedroom remained dark. Linda never stirred. That detail stayed with him longer than he expected. Not because it hurt, because it confirmed how certain she was that he would still be there in the morning. At 12:14 a.m., Robert took one final look through the windshield at the cream-colored house on Cedar Hollow Drive. The porch light glowed softly against the autumn darkness. For a brief moment, memories tried to surface again. Christmas mornings, children running through sprinklers, Linda asleep beside him during thunderstorms years ago, when they still reached for each other naturally in the dark. Robert closed his eyes. Then he put the truck in reverse. No note. No dramatic goodbye. No final speech. Linda had already given him all the information he needed. The tires rolled slowly away from the curb. By the time the house disappeared behind him, Robert Whitman was already emotionally somewhere else. 40 minutes later, he checked into room 114 at a modest extended-stay motel off Brookfield Parkway. The clerk barely looked up from the television while handing him the keycard. Inside the room, the walls were thin, the carpet smelled faintly of bleach, and the coffee maker was bolted to the counter to prevent theft. Robert sat on the edge of the bed in silence. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Thomas Bennett. "She awake yet?" Robert looked at the screen for several seconds before replying. "Not yet." Then he turned off the lamp and waited for morning to begin dismantling the rest of Linda Whitman's world. Linda Whitman woke up at 7:12 the next morning, expecting silence. Instead, she found absence. Robert's side of the bed was untouched. His closet door stood partially open. Several hangers remained empty, swinging slightly from the airflow of the ceiling vent. At first, she assumed he had gone for a drive. Then she noticed the missing document box from the office downstairs. The realization arrived slowly enough to feel unreal. By 7:26, Linda was moving quickly through the house, with her phone pressed against her ear. Robert watched the incoming calls from room 114 of the Brookfield extended stay while sitting at the small table beside the motel window. Outside, cold October wind pushed leaves across the parking lot in uneven circles. 7 missed calls. Then 9. Then 12. At 8:03, Thomas Bennett texted, "She's pacing the driveway." Robert typed back calmly, "Keep watching." Thomas lived only 2 streets away from Cedar Hollow Drive and had parked nearby at Robert's request before sunrise. Not because Robert wanted revenge, because he wanted confirmation. At 8:11, Linda finally left him a voicemail. Her voice sounded controlled, but Robert immediately recognized the strain underneath it. "Robert, this isn't funny. Call me back." 3 minutes later, another voicemail arrived. "Where are you?" Then another. "We need to talk." Robert stared at the screen without emotion. Funny, he thought. Linda still believed conversation could repair consequences already set in motion. At 8:24, Robert finally answered. "What?" Linda snapped immediately. Robert sipped motel coffee before speaking. "Good morning." "Don't do that," she hissed. "Where are you?" "I'm safe." "Robert, stop this nonsense and come home." Home. The words sounded strange now. Robert glanced around the motel room with its faded curtains and bolted coffee maker. Oddly enough, this place already felt more honest than the house on Cedar Hollow Drive. "You should check the joint account," he said calmly. Silence. "What?" "The joint account," Robert repeated. "Then call me back." He ended the call before she could respond. For the next 20 minutes, Robert imagined the exact sequence unfolding inside the Whitman house. Linda rushing toward her laptop, logging into online banking, refreshing the page repeatedly because surely there had to be a mistake. The checking account nearly empty, savings transferred, operating funds moved, and finally the cold realization that Robert Whitman had not disappeared emotionally. He had prepared financially. At 8:51, Thomas texted again. "She just left fast." Robert checked the timestamp and nodded slightly to himself. "She's going to a lawyer," he murmured. Exactly 34 minutes later, Victoria Hale called. She retained counsel. Robert leaned back in his chair. "Who?" "Richard Coleman." Robert recognized the name vaguely. Divorce attorney in Brentwood. Aggressive reputation. Loud in court. Frequently quoted online describing himself as relentless. Victoria sounded almost amused. "He thinks this is a standard marital asset dispute." Robert looked out the window at the gray Tennessee sky. "And it isn't." "No," Victoria replied calmly. "It definitely isn't." Later that afternoon, Robert drove to Victoria's office carrying coffee and a folder containing updated account confirmations. Victoria reviewed everything carefully. "The transfers are complete," she said. "All legal, fully documented." Robert nodded once. "And the old company?" Victoria almost smiled. "Still exists, but Whitman Residential Group now contains approximately $412, outdated maintenance equipment, and a storage unit lease." Robert sat quietly. 14 months earlier, that knowledge would have felt vindictive. Now, it simply felt necessary. Victoria closed the folder. "Richard Coleman is going to come after the business first," she explained. "That's where he expects the value." "He won't find much." "No," Victoria agreed. "He won't." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria looked at Robert more carefully. "You know what's interesting?" "What?" "Your wife still thinks this started last night." Robert stared at the polished wood surface of her desk, but he understood something Linda still did not. Last night had only been the moment the explosion became visible. The real destruction had started 14 months earlier, in a quiet law office on Maple Avenue, when a 67-year-old man stopped hoping his marriage would heal itself and began preparing to survive its collapse instead. And somewhere across town, Richard Coleman was just beginning to realize he had arrived very late to a war that had already been strategically lost. By the third day, the story Linda Whitman told people had already started changing. First, Robert had supposedly suffered some kind of emotional breakdown. Then he had vanished unexpectedly. By Thursday afternoon, according to Susan Bennett, who heard it through 3 different neighborhood phone calls, Linda was telling people her husband had become unstable after retirement and was refusing to communicate rationally. Robert listened to all of this from room 114 with surprising calm. People always rush to control the narrative when they sense control slipping elsewhere. That alone told him Linda was scared. Outside the motel window, rain fell steadily across Brookfield Parkway, while Robert sat at the small desk reviewing financial documents Victoria Hale had organized into neat labeled folders. Every transfer, every contract, every account migration. 14 months of quiet preparation compressed into paper evidence. At 3:47 p.m., his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Nashville area code. Robert answered carefully. Mr. Whitman? The voice belonged to a younger man. Professional, alert. Yes. My name is Michael Turner. I'm a business reporter with the Nashville Tribune. Robert sat still immediately. Michael continued. I've been investigating irregular vendor payments connected to Mercer Freight Solutions and a consulting company called Summit Asset Consulting. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Robert looked slowly toward the rain-covered parking lot outside. I believe your company may have processed some of those payments, Michael added. I was hoping we could speak. For several seconds, Robert said nothing, because he had never contacted the Tribune. Victoria had not. Samuel Briggs had not, which meant somebody else had leaked the story. And the list of people aware of Summit Asset Consulting was extremely short. Then the answer arrived all at once. Daniel Mercer. Robert almost admired the speed of it. The man sleeping with another person's wife for 4 years had apparently decided that loyalty ended the moment legal consequences appeared. Daniel was protecting himself, and in doing so, he had quietly abandoned Linda without warning. There's a coffee shop near Maple Avenue, Robert said calmly. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Michael agreed immediately. After the call ended, Robert sat motionless for nearly a full minute. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed once under his breath. Not because anything about the situation was funny, because sometimes the universe solved problems more efficiently than people did. The following morning, Robert arrived early at the coffee shop. Michael Turner looked younger than Robert expected. Late 30s, maybe. Corduroy jacket, sharp eyes that scanned people the way contractors inspected buildings before demolition. A recorder sat on the table between them. Michael wasted very little time. How long have you known about the fraudulent invoices? Robert placed Samuel Briggs' envelope carefully onto the table. Long enough. Michael opened the envelope slowly. As he reviewed the contents, his expression changed almost immediately. Hotel photographs, financial transfers, Shell vendor records, approval signatures. The entire hidden structure started revealing itself, page by page. After several minutes, Michael looked up. Does your wife know you have this? No. And Daniel Mercer? Robert leaned back slightly. I imagine he's beginning to realize exactly how much trouble he's in. Michael studied him carefully. You're remarkably calm about all this. Robert considered the question honestly. No, he said. I was angry 14 months ago. The reporter stopped writing for a second. 14 months. That number clearly mattered. Robert explained the restructuring carefully, without disclosing unnecessary details. Everything legal, everything documented. Every business decision supported by legitimate operational reasoning. Michael listened with growing interest. Finally, he closed the folder. You prepared for this. Robert glanced toward the front windows, where morning traffic moved through downtown Franklin. Yes, he answered quietly. I did. At 11:18 a.m., Robert walked out of the coffee shop and called Victoria Hale. He's going forward with the story, Robert said. Victoria sounded unsurprised. Good. You think this changes things? Oh, it changes everything. Back at Mercer Freight Solutions, Daniel Mercer still believed he was controlling the damage. What he failed to understand was that scandals behaved exactly like structural fires. Once the foundation caught, it no longer mattered who started the flames. The collapse became inevitable for everyone still standing inside. The article appeared online at 6:12 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday morning. Robert Whitman was awake before sunrise, sitting at the small table in room 114 with a paper cup of motel coffee cooling beside him when his phone buzzed with a message from Victoria Hale. It's live. That was all she wrote. Robert opened the link slowly. The headline filled the screen immediately. Nashville Tribune investigates fraudulent vendor payments inside Mercer Freight Solutions. Below it sat Daniel Mercer's photograph. Confident smile. Tailored suit. The expression of a man who had spent years believing consequences were things that happened to less careful people. Robert read carefully. Michael Turner had done thorough work. The article outlined the entire Summit Asset Consulting scheme, piece by piece. Shell invoices, undocumented consulting payments, suspicious financial transfers, and internal approval patterns stretching back several years. Mercer Freight Solutions was named repeatedly. Daniel Mercer was identified directly. And then Robert reached the 4th paragraph. He stopped reading for several seconds, because there it was. Linda Whitman. her full name sitting inside the Nashville Tribune for the entire state to read. The article identified her as the operations manager responsible for processing many of the vendor payments tied to Summit Asset Consulting. No dramatic accusations, no sensational language, just facts. Cold, precise facts. Oddly enough, that made it worse. Robert leaned back slowly in his chair and stared toward the motel window while rain slid down the glass in uneven streaks. Somewhere across Franklin, Linda was waking up to discover that her private betrayal had become public collapse. His phone rang almost immediately. Thomas Bennett. Robert answered without speaking. "Well," Thomas said, "the neighborhood's awake now." Robert closed his eyes briefly. "How bad?" Thomas laughed once under his breath. "Carol says 3 women at the coffee shop were discussing Linda before 7 o'clock. That sounded about right." Cedar Hollow Drive survived on curated appearances. Perfect lawns, holiday decorations installed on schedule, smiling conversations hiding private disappointments behind expensive front doors. Scandal moved through neighborhoods like that faster than weather warnings. Thomas lowered his voice slightly. Richard Coleman dropped her. Robert opened his eyes again. "What?" "Apparently happened yesterday afternoon. Conflict concerns." Robert almost smiled. Conflict concerns. A polite legal phrase meaning the attorney had realized his client was no longer simply an unfaithful spouse involved in a divorce. She was potentially connected to financial fraud. Even an aggressive divorce lawyer knew when standing beside a client became professionally dangerous. At 8:41 a.m., Linda finally called. Robert let it ring 4 times before answering. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Linda inhaled sharply. "You gave them those documents." Robert looked calmly at the article still glowing on his screen. "I protected myself. You destroyed me." The words came out broken now, not angry, terrified. Robert remained silent because this was the first truly honest moment Linda had experienced since everything began. For the first time, she understood she was no longer controlling the story. "I can explain this," she whispered desperately. "No," Robert replied quietly. "You can explain it to investigators." Silence. Then he heard something unexpected on the other end of the line. Crying. Not graceful crying, real panic. The sound of someone realizing consequences had finally arrived faster than excuses could keep up. "You planned all this," Linda said weakly. Robert stared out at the gray Tennessee morning. Outside, cars moved through rain-soaked streets, while ordinary people continued ordinary lives, completely unaware that another marriage had just collapsed under the weight of secrets and arrogance. "No," he answered calmly. "I prepared for it." Linda said nothing after that, because somewhere deep down, she finally understood the difference. Preparation was quiet. Preparation was patient. And while she spent 4 years believing Robert Whitman was too loyal, too old, and too emotionally predictable to ever look beneath the surface of their life together, he had already been dismantling the ground beneath her feet piece by piece. The call ended softly. Robert placed the phone face down on the table and returned to reading the article from the beginning, not out of satisfaction, but because after 14 months of preparation, the truth no longer belonged only to him anymore. Now the entire world could see it too. The divorce hearing lasted 36 minutes. Robert Whitman timed it accidentally because the clock on the courtroom wall sat directly above the judge's bench. And after months of legal meetings, financial disclosures, and controlled silence, he found himself watching seconds pass, the way contractors watch concrete cure. Slowly, carefully, irreversibly. The Duval County Courthouse smelled faintly of old carpet, printer toner, and burnt coffee from a vending machine near the elevators. Outside, January rain darkened the sidewalks of downtown Franklin, while people hurried past the building without realizing entire lives were being dismantled quietly inside. Robert sat beside Victoria Hale at the front table. Across the room, Linda Whitman avoided looking at him directly. She appeared thinner now, not dramatically, just diminished somehow. The confidence she carried the night she stood smiling in the kitchen doorway had disappeared completely over the past 11 weeks. The expensive clothes remained, the careful makeup remained, but the certainty underneath them was gone. Her new attorney, a younger woman named Melissa Grant, shuffled paperwork with the exhausted professionalism of someone handed a case already bleeding out before she arrived. The article from the Nashville Tribune had changed everything. After publication, Mercer Freight Solutions launched an internal audit. Daniel Mercer resigned quietly 3 weeks later, citing personal reasons, which nobody believed. Rumors spread that he relocated somewhere outside Las Vegas, doing independent consulting work under contract. Robert never bothered confirming whether it was true. Daniel Mercer no longer mattered. Neither did revenge. At precisely 10:14 a.m., the judge finalized the division of assets. The house on Cedar Hollow Drive had already sold 30 days earlier. Linda received $84,000 after mortgage balances, fees, and legal expenses were deducted. She also retained partial ownership of the original Whitman Residential Group shell company, which now contained little more than outdated maintenance equipment, minor operating cash, and a storage unit lease on Riverstone Avenue. Victoria once described it privately as an empty wrapper around a business that no longer exists. Robert thought that was accurate. The actual operating company, the real contracts, accounts, equipment, vendors, and management structure had legally belonged to the reorganized entity for months before Linda ever confessed the affair. Everything had been documented, measured, prepared. The judge signed the final order. Just like that, 31 years became paperwork. Linda finally glanced toward Robert, while attorneys gathered folders and exchanged closing remarks. For a brief moment, he saw something unfamiliar in her expression. Not hatred, not even sadness. Confusion. As though some part of her still could not fully understand how the quiet man she underestimated had outlasted her completely. Robert felt no satisfaction looking back at her. That surprised him. People imagined revenge as a moment of triumph, some cinematic emotional release where pain transformed into victory. But standing inside that courtroom, Robert mostly felt tired in a clean, honest way, like finishing demolition on a dangerous structure after months spent making sure it collapsed without killing anyone underneath. Outside the courthouse, Victoria opened her umbrella against the rain. "It's done," she said. Robert nodded once. "Yes." She studied him carefully. "How do you feel?" Robert considered the question while cars hissed through rainwater nearby. Finally, he answered truthfully, "Stable." Victoria smiled slightly. "That's healthier than happy." They walked in silence toward the parking lot. Later that afternoon, Robert drove to his new apartment on Ashford Street, overlooking downtown Franklin. The building was modest but quiet, with large east-facing windows and hardwood floors that creaked softly at night. Nobody else's name appeared on the lease. That mattered more to him than luxury ever could now. Inside the apartment, movers had already placed Evelyn Whitman's portrait against the living room wall, waiting to be rehung. Robert carried it carefully into the sunlight near the windows. For several moments, he simply stood there staring at his mother's painted face while the city moved quietly below. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Thomas Bennett. "You survived it." Robert looked around the apartment slowly. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. After a long moment, he typed back 4 simple words. "I plan to." The divorce hearing lasted 36 minutes. Robert Whitman timed it accidentally because the clock on the courtroom wall sat directly above the judge's bench. And after months of legal meetings, financial disclosures, and controlled silence, he found himself watching seconds pass the way contractors watched concrete cure. Slowly, carefully, irreversibly. The Duval County Courthouse smelled faintly of old carpet, printer toner, and burnt coffee from a vending machine near the elevators. Outside, January rain darkened the sidewalks of downtown Franklin, while people hurried past the building without realizing entire lives were being dismantled quietly inside. Robert sat beside Victoria Hale at the front table. Across the room, Linda Whitman avoided looking at him directly. She appeared thinner now, not dramatically, just diminished somehow. The confidence she carried the night she stood smiling in the kitchen doorway had disappeared completely over the past 11 weeks. The expensive clothes remained. The careful makeup remained, but the certainty underneath them was gone. Her new attorney, a younger woman named Melissa Grant, shuffled paperwork with the exhausted professionalism of someone handed a case already bleeding out before she arrived. The article from the Nashville Tribune had changed everything. After publication, Mercer Freight Solutions launched an internal audit. Daniel Mercer resigned quietly 3 weeks later, citing personal reasons, which nobody believed. Rumors spread that he relocated somewhere outside Las Vegas, doing independent consulting work under contract. Robert never bothered confirming whether it was true. Daniel Mercer no longer mattered. Neither did revenge. At precisely 10:14 a.m., the judge finalized the division of assets. The house on Cedar Hollow Drive had already sold 30 days earlier. Linda received $84,000 after mortgage balances, fees, and legal expenses were deducted. She also retained partial ownership of the original Whitman Residential Group shell company, which now contained little more than outdated maintenance equipment, minor operating cash, and a storage unit lease on Riverstone Avenue. Victoria once described it privately as an empty wrapper around a business that no longer exists. Robert thought that was accurate. The actual operating company, the real contracts, accounts, equipment, vendors, and management structure, had legally belonged to the reorganized entity for months before Linda ever confessed the affair. Everything had been documented, measured, prepared. The judge signed the final order. Just like that, 31 years became paperwork. Linda finally glanced toward Robert while attorneys gathered folders and exchanged closing remarks. For a brief moment, he saw something unfamiliar in her expression. Not hatred, not even sadness, confusion, as though some part of her still could not fully understand how the quiet man she underestimated had outlasted her completely. Robert felt no satisfaction looking back at her. That surprised him. People imagined revenge as a moment of triumph, some cinematic emotional release where pain transformed into victory. But standing inside that courtroom, Robert mostly felt tired in a clean, honest way, like finishing demolition on a dangerous structure after months spent making sure it collapsed without killing anyone underneath it. Outside the courthouse, Victoria opened her umbrella against the rain. "It's done," she said. Robert nodded once. Yes. She studied him carefully. "How do you feel?" Robert considered the question while cars hissed through rainwater nearby. Finally, he answered truthfully. "Stable." Victoria smiled slightly. "That's healthier than happy." They walked in silence toward the parking lot. Later that afternoon, Robert drove to his new apartment on Ashford Street, overlooking downtown Franklin. The building was modest but quiet, with large east-facing windows and hardwood floors that creaked softly at night. Nobody else's name appeared on the lease. That mattered more to him than luxury ever could now. Inside the apartment, movers had already placed Evelyn Whitman's portrait against the living room wall, waiting to be rehung. Robert carried it carefully into the sunlight near the windows. For several moments, he simply stood there, staring at his mother's painted face while the city moved quietly below. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Thomas Bennett. "You survived it." Robert looked around the apartment slowly. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. After a long moment, he typed back 4 simple words. "I plan to." 3 days after the divorce became official, Robert Whitman drove back to Cedar Hollow Drive one final time. It was just after 10 in the morning. The winter sky hung low and gray above Franklin, Tennessee, while cold wind pushed brittle leaves along the sidewalks in restless circles. Robert parked half a block away from the house that had once held nearly every important memory of his adult life. He did not get out of the truck immediately. Instead, he sat quietly, with both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the familiar neighborhood. The new owners had already changed the shutters. Linda would have hated the color. That thought almost made him smile. Almost. A landscaping truck idled farther down the street, while someone unloaded mulch near a driveway. A woman walked a golden retriever past the Whitman house without looking at it twice. Somewhere nearby, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically despite the January cold. Ordinary life had continued exactly the way it always did. That was the strange thing about personal disasters. The world barely paused for them. Robert leaned back slowly against the seat. 31 years. The number no longer hurt the way it once had. Now, it simply existed, like an old scar that still carried shape but no longer carried pain. He thought about the first time Linda saw the house decades earlier when it was still unfinished. She had stood in the empty kitchen laughing while construction dust covered the floors because she could already picture Thanksgiving dinners and grandchildren and Christmas decorations near the staircase. Back then, Robert believed they were building something permanent, and maybe for a while they had been. Not every memory inside that house was poisoned. Robert refused to rewrite history just because the ending turned ugly. There had been good years, real years. Years when Linda loved him honestly, and he loved her back without suspicion. They raised 2 children inside those walls who grew into decent adults. They built a successful company from almost nothing. They survived layoffs, recessions, illnesses, debt, and funerals together. Those things mattered, even now. Especially now. Robert glanced toward the passenger seat where Evelyn Whitman's portrait rested carefully wrapped beneath the blanket. The painting had already been rehung inside his new apartment on Ashford Street, but he had brought it with him this morning anyway, without fully understanding why. Maybe because his mother represented the version of life that existed before betrayal complicated everything. Or maybe because some part of him still needed witness to the ending. His phone buzzed softly in the cup holder. A message from Emily. His daughter had checked on him almost every day since the article appeared. "You okay?" Robert looked back toward the house one last time before replying, "Yes." And for the first time in a very long time, the answer felt completely true. Not because life had turned out the way he wanted, not because he had won. Robert no longer thought in those terms. Winning implied triumph. This was something quieter, something steadier. He thought about the night Linda stood smiling in the kitchen doorway, expecting him to collapse emotionally in front of her. She believed patience meant weakness because she confused silence with surrender. But silence and surrender were never the same thing. A patient man was not harmless. A patient man was simply preparing. Robert had learned that too late to save his marriage, but not too late to save himself. Outside, wind moved through Cedar Hollow Drive again, carrying dead leaves across the pavement in long, uneven lines. Robert started the truck. For a brief second, he considered looking into the rearview mirror one last time after pulling away. He decided against it. The past had already taken enough of his attention. As the neighborhood slowly disappeared behind him, Robert Whitman felt something settle quietly inside his chest. Not happiness, not revenge, peace. The kind earned by a man who saw collapse coming early enough to build solid ground beneath himself before everything else finally gave way. His father used to repeat the same phrase every time they worked construction together back in Joliet. Measure twice, cut once. At 67 years old, Robert finally understood the lesson completely, because careful men survive things emotional men never saw coming. And whatever waited ahead of him now would at least be built on truth.